We're covering the nervous system. This is all about survival. My name is Brad Richardson. I've been teaching anatomy for about 24 years now, and I try to simplify things the best I can, especially when we get to the nervous system. And what we're discussing is how do we process information from my body, the peripheral side, all the way to the central nervous system, and then get a response back. We do two things in our body. We survive and reproduce. We don't talk about this in the text a lot, but a lot of what we're doing is maintaining homeostasis. And how do we do that? We have to process things with the central nervous system. As I talk about this, I'll flip back and forth to some of the graphics I've used in previous videos because I think it helps to understand the topic. But we're discussing a reflex. And how do we reflex? In a previous video, we had discussed when we look at how do we coordinate the body and its information processing, that I used the mnemonics, same and Dave. And we described that our body really does two primary things. It senses and it reacts, and there could be an interpretation in between. And that sensory is also called the afferent division, meaning the A, it goes to the central nervous system, versus motor, it's going out away from the central nervous system. And dorsal is my afferent. So afferent is also called dorsal. What do we mean by that? That all the information that as we start to process it goes to the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Versus when I look at my ventral side, the efferent information, all of the motor processing is going out the front side or the ventral side to then communicate to the body what we're going to do. So our same and Dave helps us to understand the first part of a reflex arc. And what do we mean by a reflex? I talk about this in the study guide if it helps you, but the reflex arc is that process of how do we get the information to go through the body. It's a quick reflex. When you have the doctor and they tap on your knee and they're checking for that movement of the knee, that's a reflex. When you step on something hot, you get a quick movement. As we describe this, I'm putting it together in 5 basic steps. I'm including an interneuron, which is part of the central nervous system. It may skip that at times and go just from a sensory to a motor, but I put it all together as one big loop. So as we describe this, we're first getting just the actual movement of survival. Even when you think about just that process, someone cuts you off on the road and you get that quick movement. You have a general reflex to survive, but then you start to think about it. So there's also that higher thought, that emotion, that learning from it that goes up to the brain. So you remember, so you survive for the next time. So let's go through this process. So the first part of the reflex is we have to sense something, and we use receptors to do that. This is not all the receptors in the body. I just give you basic examples. But the first part is having that sensory reception. A lot of things like touch and pain are part of the extension of the dendrites of the neurons, and some are more specialized when we get into our special senses. But our sensoreceptors, they can pick up things like temperature, so thermoreceptors. Some are specialized for pain, nociceptors, and these can go hand in hand if you step on something hot. Mechano is relating to pressure. When we get into talking about hearing and sound, we rely on the pressure of fluids to help us hear. Chemoreceptors, the chemical changes in my body. Even as I breathe, the oxygen, carbon dioxide changes. Photoreceptors, the light and the dark, as we see. And then proprioceptors, I love proprioceptors because it's where I'm at in space. How do I know my joints, my muscles, my hands without hitting the camera? How do I know when to stop? When I'm walking, we'll talk about the coordination with different structures of the brain. And how do I know before I'm going to hit the wall and I grab the door and move it? How far do I move the door? So there's proprioception to know where I'm at in space. So I use all these receptors to be part of a sensory neuron, or they're talking to a sensory neuron. So the sensory receptors talk to the sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron, remember, is same and Dave. We have different types of neurons. If you remember when we go back to the different types, that we have anaxonal, unipolar or unipolar, bipolar. These 3 are my sensory function. Bipolar we see a lot in special senses. And then multipolar are our motor functions. So don't forget to look at those, understanding the basics of what the different neurons do. So as I go through, sensory neuron is then going to communicate on the posterior side or dorsal side. That's my Dave. Dorsal is afferent. It runs through a ganglion here, a dorsal root ganglion. What is a ganglion? Remember our definitions that we talked about in the previous video, that a ganglia is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, because we haven't quite hit it yet. So these are dorsal root ganglia, or a ganglion that we see here, a collection of cell bodies. So if I go back to that, I run through the dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal root, and now I start to enter into the spinal cord. I reach the middle portion here, which we call the interneuron. Remember I said we could skip that in some cases, and what we haven't talked about yet is some arcs or reflexes can be monosynaptic, they can be polysynaptic, so there's different types. But as I look at interneuron, we're going to process the information here, that is a motor function, to then connect to a motor neuron that goes out the ventral side, again part of my day, through the ventral root, and that ventral neuron is going to reach what we're trying to target, which we call the effector, typically a muscle or a gland, smooth, cardiac, skeletal, and any of the glands in my body, specifically the ones that release a lot of hormones. So we're releasing at the effector, and that's where we get into, we talk about the neuromuscular junction, especially when we talk about movement of muscles, when we did sliding filament theory. So we're understanding this process of just the general reflex. I step on something hot, innately I'm just going to back away. My body knows this is wrong. And then once I hit the spinal cord, it can go up to the brain, talk to me, and tell me, why did you do that? You stepped on this again, you knew that it was hot, or maybe I didn't know, and I'm learning. I feel that emotion from it, and I process it for the next time, because we're surviving and we're going through reproduction. So as we describe this, we're just looking at the basic reflex to go through the spinal cord, which can be independent of the brain, to create that survival mechanism. So sensory receptor talks to the sensory neuron. Sometimes they're one the same. I get to the spinal cord through the dorsal side. That's my interneuron. And then I hit the motor neuron to go out the front or ventral side and hit the target. Now we'll talk about different reflexes later when we get into the autonomic nervous system, but this is just the response of a basic reflex arc. Information processing.